All right, so let's start with the big story that we are tracking on WION at this hour. A U.S. appeals court has ruled that most of President Trump's global tariffs were illegal. In a pretty startling verdict that was given on Friday before the Labor Day weekend, a panel of judges said that Trump had exceeded his authority. Now, the appeals court upheld an earlier ruling by the Court of International Trade that Trump had wrongfully invoked an emergency law to impose the tariffs. But the appeals court judges sent the case back to the lower court to determine if it applies to everyone affected by the tariffs or just the parties involved in the case. In the meantime, the tariffs imposed were allowed to remain in place as the litigation proceeds. With the latest ruling, the analysts are now saying that the case will almost certainly end up at the American Supreme Court. Now, the court said tonight, quote here, the statute bestows significant authority on the president to undertake a number of actions in response to a declared national emergency. But none of these actions explicitly include the power to impose tariffs, duties or the like, or the power to tax. Now, in response, Trump on social media said that all tariffs are still in effect. A highly partisan appeals court incorrectly said that our tariffs should be removed, but they know that the United States of America will win in the end. He added if these tariffs ever went away, it would be a total disaster for the country. Now, ahead of the ruling, Trump's cabinet officials had warned that the court that declaring tariffs unlawful would have a devastating impact on American foreign policy. The Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had warned of dangerous diplomatic embarrassment. The administration has filed statement by Bessent, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and Secretary of State Marco Rubio in the U.S. Court of Appeals before the verdict. Now, they were filed in support of a request that any ruling against the administration would be immediately put on hold until the U.S. Supreme Court issues a final decision. Howard Lutnick had said that failing to do so would have a devastating and a dire impact, but the appeals court ruled against the administration. Still, the court guarded the lower court to follow a recent Supreme Court ruling on Trump's executive order on automatic birthright citizenship. The Supreme Court had ordered that judges should limit their rulings to the parties involved in the case rather than applying across the country, known as universal injunctions. The scope of that verdict leaves many questions unanswered. All right, now joining us from Minnesota, we've got Mr. Richard William Painter. He's a lawyer and also a professor. And Professor Richard was, in fact, the chief White House ethics lawyer in the George W. Bush's administration. Professor, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on WION. Now, this of course, is a ruling that is going to throw up a whole lot of questions in terms of what now happens to these tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. For the time being, these tariffs are still in place. But the fact that the appeals court has said that Trump went beyond what is given to him as his authority to impose these tariffs now puts a lot of question marks on what happens from here on. In your assessment, what is the significance of this ruling by the appeals court, and how does Donald Trump take his tariffs forward from here?
This is a very important ruling of the Court of Appeals in the United States. Our Constitution specifically says that Congress imposes taxes through statutes, and a tariff is a tax. It's a very large tax in some of these instances, and Congress has to authorize a tariff. Congress has authorized the president to impose tariffs in a very narrow range of circumstances in response to emergencies or the actions of foreign governments in the trade sphere. But only in very limited circumstances. For broad sweeping tariffs, such as those being imposed by the Trump administration, the president needs to go to Congress and have a law passed by Congress authorizing the tariffs. And President Trump did not do that. And that is why most of these tariffs that he has imposed probably are unconstitutional. And I would expect the Supreme Court to rule the same way. These tariffs have a substantial impact on the economy. In contrary to what the Treasury Department is saying, every time the president has announced broad sweeping tariffs, the stock market has gone down substantially. The economy is very, very much impacted by tariffs, and usually negatively. We've had very bad experiences with tariffs in the past, causing economic havoc. And also the impact on foreign policy is substantial, which is why Congress needs to have its constitutional role here.
Right.
President Trump has imposed tariffs on India, 50%, simply because India imports Russian oil. Well, that is using a tariff, a tax, as an instrument of foreign policy to try to coerce India into not importing Russian oil. If the president chooses to use a tax, a tariff, in that manner, he needs to go to Congress. That's required under our Constitution.
Professor, I think you've made a very important point there. If the president wants to impose these tariffs, he needs ratification from the Congress. But this case will now go to the Supreme Court. Is there a timeline that we can look at? Because there is a lot of uncertainty with respect to what is happening with the world economy because of these tariffs. If this case were to go to the Supreme Court, how soon can we have a judgment from the Supreme Court about whether Trump can impose these tariffs or not, or whether he needs the consent of the Congress to impose these tariffs? When can we have clarity on this, and how long can this case drag in the Supreme Court?
Unfortunately, litigation before the Supreme Court can take quite some time, and this issue may not be definitively resolved by the Supreme Court for a year, or maybe even as long as a year and a half. We'll see how quickly this moves along, and also what lower court judges are allowed to do. In the meantime, a lower court judge cannot impose a nationwide injunction, but the Federal Court of Trade may be able to, Federal Trade Court may be able to put a stop to some of these tariffs in the meantime while the Supreme Court decides. I should emphasize, however, that the markets, the financial markets, are one of the strongest corrective mechanisms with respect to President Trump's tariff policy. The message has been very clear from the financial markets that these tariffs are viewed very, very negatively. And the only reason the stock market is quite high right now in the United States is that Donald Trump has backed off on most of his tariff threats against other nations. And the market prices are not assuming that there is going to be a global trade war. But if there is, that could end up in calamity. That's exactly what happened in 1930 when Congress did pass a broad sweeping tariff bill, which led to retaliation from other countries around the world and caused a Great Depression. We don't want that again. The financial markets are aware of this problem. And I don't think Donald Trump wants to throw the economy into a recession when we have an election for Congress coming up next November.
I think that's going to be a significant thing to watch out for. Thank you very much indeed, Professor William, for joining us and giving so much perspective into how this case can progress from here on. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.